Holocaust Awareness Webinar. Awareness Week, my bad. I am Brian Garcia. I am a student leader here at Hello at FIU, and I'll be introducing tonight's event, Anti-Antisemitism Online and in Real Life, Fighting Anti-Semitism in the 21st Century. Before I introduce our speakers today or tonight, I would like to acknowledge and thank our co-sponsors, Hello International, the Anti-Defamation League, and the Consulate General of Israel in Miami. We're grateful for your contributions to and participation in this event. And now allow me to introduce our panelists. Joining us today is Matthew Berger, is the Vice President for External Affairs and Campus Preparedness at Hello International. Berger oversees programs addressing anti-Semitic incidents, anti-Israel activity, and security concerns on college campuses. Mike Dreketz is the Deputy Consul General of Israel in Miami. The mission of the consulate is to promote the interests of the State of Israel and create partnerships with the citizens and governments of Florida, Kansas, Missouri, and Puerto Rico in the realms of policy issues, economic affairs, public information, media, culture, and other aspects of community relations. Vlad Haikin is the National Director of Programs on Anti-Semitism at the Anti-Defamation League. A former refugee from state-sponsored anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union and grandson of Holocaust survivors, Vlad works to secure justice and fair treatment for all. Aaron Schrody is an environmental activist, social entrepreneur, and vice president of the board of directors of Zionists, an organization whose mission is to equip and inspire Jews and allies to fight for social justice in the U.S. as proud Zionists. And with that, let me hand over the spotlight to our moderator, the executive director of Hello at FIU, John Warwick.
All right, thank you very much, Brian, and thank you everyone for joining us. Hopefully, Vlad will be here soon. I reached out, but let's get right into it here. So I originally wanted to start with what is the most recent incident, the hostage situation at the synagogue in Texas. But here in Miami, just yesterday, residents of Miami Beach, received letters on their doorways, basically blaming COVID on the Jewish people. They listed the CDC members who are Jewish and Pfizer, people who are Jewish. But at the bottom it says these flyers, I just want to read this correctly, were distributed randomly and without malicious intent. And on a similar note, when the hostage situation at the synagogue in Texas, we were also told by media and the FBI at first that the incident was not directly targeting Jews. So I do feel there's a tie between the two things, in that we're often told that what's happening is not really happening. So let me start that. Let's start there with all of you, and Vlad, thanks for joining. We can kind of go around, or anyone can just answer. Mike, let's start with you.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I think that anti-Semitism is not a new problem. It's a problem that has existed for the last 3,000 or so years, and we are living right now in a time of the change of the politically correct. When the Holocaust happened, like 8 years ago, it was very, very complicated to talk about the Jews. This is something that was very, very recent in the heads of everyone, in the memories of everyone, and it was not politically correct to talk about the Jews. But anti-Semitism also always existed, and it will continue to exist, unfortunately. And it's not only a Jewish issue. This is something that has to be shared to everyone. And the thing is, this is the fact that it's not called an act against the Jews at first. It's the same way that all the terrorist attacks in Israel are alleged terrorist attacks. They are not terrorist attacks at first sight. We are living in a world where the politically correct has taken a place that replaces the facts. And this is something that has to be taken care of, because it's a narrative, and it's something that has changed. And this is the reason it's very, very difficult to admit the obvious, to state the obvious in those days. And the fact that we are getting, farther from the Holocaust, and that we have the new social media and fake news and the whole environment of information, of terabytes of information that are coming every day, it becomes harder and harder every day to state the obvious. So I presume, from my perspective, that this is a shift change in the politically correct versus facts.
I can tell Aaron wants to say something, so I'm gonna.
No, I'm just listening. I think we all are on the same page here in the way that the ecosystem, both online and off, has changed in a really vicious manner. And this is not a new issue, and it's not going anywhere. But we have to combat it in new ways because it's been unchecked for far too long, and particularly in digital spheres that were largely seeded by a lot of mainstream Jewish organizations, a lot of Jews of a certain age, a lot of people, right? We control the media, we control power, but we've done a pretty bad job in the digital sphere then, if that's the trope you want to buy into. And so here we are playing this perpetual game of catch up, where the narratives are being written not by us, not by those who are targeted or victimized. And now we are left to counter that narrative. We have to prove lies a lie before we can speak our truth. And too many people have already had their perspectives and their facts, if you will, put in front of them. And that's a harder game when we haven't gotten out front, which is why I'm grateful for the work of so many of the people on this call, the work that you do with Hillel, and the work of so many Jewish organizations who are saying we need to reach people before it's too late so that we, Jews, define anti-Semitism in both a historic and modern context.
I mean,
I think,
yep.
John, I think we also have to recognize the places where there's a lack of education versus the places where there's malicious intent. And I think that when I watched in real time the situation in Colleyville with the FBI assistant director or special agent in charge in Dallas making that comment, and I think that was a lack of education. I think that was a moment where he was trying to say one thing, which was that the motive was specifically to try to get this woman freed. And the way he said it made it sound as an attack on the experiences of the Jewish hostages inside. And that's an opportunity for education. And then there are other places where there is malicious intent, where there's a specific action trying to recognize targeting of Jews has been going on for decades and for centuries. I think we have to differentiate between the two. And I think we have to realize that we need to work harder on education. We need to be doing more of education. My friend Vlad, has done with the ADL, has done a lot of great work educating law enforcement, but there's clearly more work that needs to be done. We need people who, when they get to that type of position in power, have had the education and have had the understanding so that they understand why a term like that or a statement like that has power.
Absolutely. Bud?
Yeah. I mean, look, I think, the first thing we have to recognize is that anti-Semitism as a phenomenon is really poorly understood in our society, right? And I think we have to take responsibility for that. There was a poll that came out from AJC that found that half of Americans either have never heard the term anti-Semitism, right, or don't know what it means. And certainly that is true at all levels of society. Decision makers, whether that's in law enforcement and government, in journalism and media, administrations on campuses, university, college campuses, high schools, all levels of society, even folks that, deal with issues of discrimination, marginalization, right? In the workplace, DEI professionals, anti-racist activists, people who are doing social change work around related issues, don't really understand anti-Semitism. And that's partly because we haven't really done the work to educate people properly on exactly what it is and to distinguish it, right? To make sure that people appreciate anti-Semitism, both in the commonalities that it shares with other forms of bigotry, be it sexism, misogyny, ableism, right? Anti-Black racism, Islamophobia, etc., as well as to understand it in its particularity, because each of these forms of misanthropy, bigotry, forms of oppression, whatever you want to term them, they certainly share things in common, but they all have the things that make them unique, right? Sexism doesn't function exactly like anti-Black racism, which doesn't function exactly like homophobia, which doesn't function exactly like anti-Semitism. And so we really need to make sure that we teach not only that anti-Semitism is part of this broader matrix of oppression, that it has a certain set of commonalities that it shares with these other phenomena, that it also is part of broadly anti-social, anti-democratic, and anti-intellectual phenomena, right? That it sort of foments conspiracy theories, anti-intellectualism, erosion of democratic norms and principles. It sort of, fosters authoritarian tendencies, and all other forms of social harm. And it's really important that people understand that anti-Semitism functions differently from other forms of bigotry, right? That it has this component which not only treats Jews as inferior, the way sexism or anti-Black racism does, right? That says that Jews are morally inferior, they're avaricious and greedy, bloodthirsty, etc. Maybe aesthetically inferior. Jews aren't as beautiful as more Eurocentric looking folks, and but also that it has this other element of sort of punching up, alleging to punch up at a diabolical power, right? Which is the source of all ills in society. So it treats Jews both as subhuman and as superhuman at the same time. And that is something that makes it quite unique. And I think also makes it so that people don't quite recognize it and don't quite understand it. Because after all, if you accept the logic of anti-Semitism, which says that Jews are more or less uniformly rich, powerful, and privileged, how can such a group be oppressed, right? And so people have a blind spot for anti-Semitism and how it shows up in our society.
So I mean, my follow-up, and anyone can answer, is how does that happen? I mean, I don't think that occurs in many other forms of hate, where two very opposite thoughts can exist about the same person. How did society get to a place where that can happen for the Jewish people?
I mean, I can offer a hypothesis, but it's these things are complex and it's hard to sort of reduce them to any one factor. But I think, when we're talking in particular about the sort of Christian sphere of influence, we have to understand that Christianity has been the dominant lens through which people have sought to understand the world, particularly around issues of good and evil, justice and injustice, right and wrong, for 2,000 years. It has shaped the way we understand our world. And in the Christian worldview, Jesus Christ is the embodiment of all that is good and just and honest and forthright, right? The embodiment of God on earth. So the people who rejected and then murdered Jesus Christ, according to the sort of deicide narrative that was at the center of Christianity for much of that 2,000 years, such a people who would reject the embodiment of godliness on earth have to be the antithesis of that, right? So if Jesus is all that is good and just and forthright, then the Jews become all that is deceitful and evil and bloodthirsty, right? And not only that, what kind of people can kill a god? Only a very evil, but also a very powerful people. And so that has been the dominant narrative that the Christian world has sort of interacted, through which the Christian world has interacted with Jews, that has experienced Jews as this sort of anti-Christian phenomenon, the embodiment of the Antichrist, right? The representatives of the devil's work on earth. And that continues to shape how we think about the world, even outside of theological or religious contexts.
What I would add is, I mean, Vlad is the scholar on the history of anti-Semitism in the room, and so I defer to him on this. But what I'll say is what's playing out today is a similar construct, a modern version of that construct, in which on the one hand, Jews are targeted as being less than, not white, not pure, and being subjected to the biases of white radical extremists. And at the same time, they're being targeted as part of the moneyed ruling class that is seen as responsible for the negative things in the world that the progressive movement is trying to fix. And so you have two audiences that are looking at Jews very differently and yet coming to the same conclusion, which is that they're not welcomed. And this creates a tension that is doubly isolating because on the one hand, the Jewish community is being targeted and isolated as a minority group. And the very, especially on college campuses, the very structure that is created to support those who are being targeted and isolated as a community are the ones that are working with those that are targeting and isolating the Jewish community. So it creates a very interesting relationship where the Jewish community feels more and more isolated by both the left and the right.
I often refer to it as something of a horseshoe mentality, where you have the two extremes converging on, we are supposedly too white, right? In stark contrast to white supremacist and Nazi ideologies that deemed us an inferior race and tried to wipe us off the face of the planet. But on the other side, we're not hurt enough. We're not treated unfairly enough. We're not scarred to the same degree. We're not Black or brown enough as X, Y, or Z historically marginalized, oppressed peoples like Jews, who are of every background, every race, shade, and place on earth as we know. And so when we don't align, you get the one to be a good Jew is, and there's some sort of litmus test, and there you have new forms of poorly veiled anti-Semitism arising. Anti-Zionism is the form du jour that's somehow accepted. And the other side, get out. Where do we want you? Not here. You are not welcome. You are inferior, in the sea, 6 feet under, in the gas chambers, take your pick. But those converge in a really, really dangerous way. And certainly in the spheres of social media, when you have extremists praising extremists with whom they disagree on 99.9% of things other than rampant, blatant Jew hatred, you know that we have a problem.
This is actually very sad that the only common ground that we have on both sides of extremism is anti-Semitism. And I will just add about what Erin just said, that from the left side, from the right side, this is white supremacy and what you mentioned before. And from the left side, you just mentioned that, but I think it can be very good to put a focus on that, about anti-Zionism, that is supposed to make right all the the extreme left movements, and it's the new mask of the new anti-Semitism. And this is something that has to be called as it is. It's anti-Semitism. It's not that you are not you don't agree with Israel's policies or with any other critics that you can put on Israel, and every country has its own critics. But from the moment that you can have a common background of anti-Semitism in both extremists from both sides, you can understand that we have a problem.
And I think there's nowhere that plays out more than on social media. And obviously that is fairly new, and has certainly led to an increase in incidents when we discuss anti-Semitism. What do we do about that? Is really my question. Is now what?
Actually, I think that social media has affected a lot of things, not only anti-Semitism. It affected elections, revolutions, riots. It's a very, very powerful tool, but also a very dangerous one. And this is when you are typing things and you have some influence, it doesn't matter if it's an influence on 100 people or 1,000, but it can grow and it can be viral in a matter of seconds. And it's a very, very powerful tool and very dangerous one in the way it can affect and endanger a lot of people with one click. In order to combat this kind of things, first, I think that it's very important to report the things that you see as an individual, okay, and to educate the person that are in the universities, the students, Jewish and non-Jewish, to when there is something that can, that doesn't stick with the facts, or something you think is a little bit, over, to report it to Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever, TikTok, and use the same tool in order to do the same in the same viral way. Okay, I know that there is a very, very powerful video that has been done in Israel that used the same kind of of very hard videos about don't go to Israel because, and then it has the audience, it already grabs the attention of the audience, and then they convey a very, very positive message about Israel, about Jews, about Jewish people, about the things that has been done. And we have to combat in the same tools. And the things it will be to report and to stick to the facts. This is the two powerful things that we can do, and to promote Israel and anti-Semitism in the social media.
So, so we at ADL have been working on this question of online extremism since 1985, which was the year the very first .com domain was registered, right? So right at the very beginnings of the internet, we realized that some of the earliest adopters of what was then couldn't even be called the internet. It was, sort of individual networks, of computers that were interlinked, right? What were called BBSs, or bulletin board systems. And what we saw was that some of the earliest folks that recognized the power of network computer systems were white supremacists. And they used it in various different ways, right? To spread propaganda, recruit new folks to their movement, to organize clandestine activities, raise money, et cetera, right? And we put out our first report that year about, saying basically, if we don't get our hands around this issue, this is going to metastasize into a really big problem. And unfortunately, years later, we see how prescient that was. I would say, I would break the problem down into a number of different areas, right? There is product, right? The actual product of these social media companies, the way the algorithms are written. There is the policy around what is allowed on these networks or not, right? The terms of service of each of these different platforms. And then the enforcement of those policies, right? And I think there's work to be done in all of those areas. We know, for example, that it's not enough to have a policy, for example, banning Holocaust denial on your network. Facebook recently adopted such a policy after many years of us coming to them and saying, Holocaust denialism is not merely, historical inaccuracy, it has an agenda, right? And part of that agenda is to make anti-Semitism feel plausible, right? Because the truth of the matter was Jews were completely helpless in stopping the genocide that was the Holocaust, right? And if the Jews are all this all-powerful entity, what happened during the Holocaust, right? It sort of undermines the logic of anti-Semitism. And so Holocaust denialism actually then promotes or makes possible the spread of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. But as we know, when we actually looked at what has happened since Facebook adopted the policy banning Holocaust denial, the actual denialism that is on the platform hasn't really disappeared. Because it's not enough to have a policy, you actually have to enforce it, right? The other thing that I'll say is on the product side of things, part of this is actually due to the business model of these companies. What we have with social media is not so different with the problem that we've had with more traditional media, although it has its own unique problems as well. But, there's the old adage, if it bleeds, it leads, right? That is to say that the more sensational a piece of content is, the more it sells. And after all, these are for-profit companies, right? Their entire business model is based on, how many eyeballs they can sell to their advertisers. And the longer you stay on their platform, the more you engage, including engage because you're upset, because something you saw was rage-inducing, the more they profit, right? So that is actually built into their algorithm. We have identified ways in which these companies are actually promoting sensationalized content, divisive content, and actually that these algorithms in some cases are leading people to more and more extremist content. In other words, they are helping to radicalize our society. And this is a really big problem, right? So we need to work on all of these areas. And these companies need to know that we are the users of Facebook, of Twitter, et cetera. We want them not to do this. We want them not to profit off of hate, off of extremism, off of division, right? So, and that requires public pressure, because at the end of the day, we are up against the profit motive, right? So, and one thing that I'll say that we are doing, at ADL is we're working behind the scenes with these companies to actually properly train their moderation team. Because again, just as it is true with, campus administrators, just as it is true with decision makers at different levels of our society, within these companies, the people that are tasked with moderating the content and taking down content that violates their terms of service around hate speech and incitement, they don't really understand anti-Semitism either. So, one of the things that we're doing is actually training their teams and creating programs to train the moderation teams of these companies so that they actually do their jobs.
I think we also have to recognize that the best way to address these issues is to create counter communities. That if you have strong, engaged communities that will help people feel less alone, less isolated, and part of something positive and engaging, they're less likely to go down these rabbit holes. What's happened over the last 2 years is that everybody has been stuck in their home and has not had the opportunity to be part of a community the same way that they were previously. We at Hillel believe strongly that the best way to fight anti-Semitism on campus is to have strong, engaged Jewish communities on campus, and to empower our students, to empower university administrators, and to empower the entire campus community to recognize what anti-Semitism is and to speak out when it happens. And when you do that, you limit the keyboard courage and you limit its influence. It's not about, those people and those elements are always going to be there. They've always been there in our society. How do we counterbalance them in a way that good prevails over evil? And that's really what we're focused on doing. One of the things that we did over the last 6 months was we created the Ownerstar Campaign, which encouraged Jewish students on campus to wear their Jewish stars, to wear other symbols of their Judaism on campus, and to talk about why they do so and why it's important to them. And the value there was, first of all, so that others who are not Jewish would see these posts and understand more about who Jews are on their campus, and also that they would feel connected to a community, that they were doing something that was not alone. They were not alone. And so the more that we can help students and help community members understand that they have a community behind them, we can minimize the influence that these negative influences can have on social media.
I would just add, sorry, Irene, I would just add regarding what Matthew just said, that I thought before, I mentioned earlier to report to Facebook, Twitter, etc., but I didn't mention that you can report everything to us. Okay, as the consulate of Miami, this is the first thing that I should have told you. You have to report it to us, because this fight of anti-Semitism is a huge thing that we are doing here in the consulate on our regional level. But there is an entire department in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Israel with analytic tools, with new technologies, algorithms, researchers that the specialty are to combat anti-Semitism, not only by blocking evil, like Vlad just said, but also with positive content that we can put and promote to the world. So Erin, sorry, and your turn.
No, not at all. I appreciate so much the work that all of you are doing and hear about it from a government perspective, from an organization perspective, from a cyber perspective, from an education perspective. But the question, what do we do about social media, I think is how we started. And most of that we are not people necessarily that are in government, that are working, in the think tanks, that are in Silicon Valley, that are even leading charges on campus. A lot of those we's are just dare I say, people using social media, just scrolling, students. And it can be really hard to see the vitriol, particularly if you're young and in the sort of spaces in which we operate. So I think one of the biggest things, the boldest things, the bravest things you can do is to speak your truth on social media. You talked about the need for communities and counter communities. And I didn't. For many years, I didn't talk about my Jewish identity because I knew from whence I came. I didn't talk about my support of Israel until I was outed, if you will. And I very quickly realized that if you were going to hate me, not work with me, or not respect me because I'm a Jew or a Zionist, come what may. But that has forced me to be out there. And the number of messages that I get of just people saying, thank you for saying that. I didn't have the words. I didn't know what's happening in anti-Semitism, in Israel, in any of these complex issues around genocide, around discrimination, does not fit cleanly and neatly into an Instagram slider or a TikTok video or a Twitter thread. And there's not one neatly delineated binary. And I think we have to remember the humanity too, and saying, I'm here for you. I hurt with you. I cry with you. And the you, yeah, Am Yisrael Chai, our people, but also putting out the truth. I'm a Jew and everything else. So does this content necessarily fit perfectly into the feed that you're trying to curate for yourself, whether you're a professional or I don't know. Frankly, I don't care, because this is who I am. This is my people. I don't wear a star around my neck. I wear shalom around my neck. I wear Israel in my ear. It's very clear to me, but it sometimes takes courage to put yourself out there publicly and say who you are and where you stand. And I think it's so important for students and for everyone to hear. It might sound trite, but we're not alone. And also my standing up against anti-Semitism or for Israel in no way contradicts any of the other beliefs or perspectives or work that I do personally or professionally.
And I think, right, I think for this message to sort of spread, on one hand, we all have to do it, right? Numbers wise, any campaign that you're talking about, anything that you're about, if we're not all involved, no one's going to hear it almost, because, based on the percentage of Jews there are in the world. But at the same time, Jewish, especially students, shouldn't feel this obligation to live their life defending being Jewish or defending Israel or defending, anything about it. So that's a hard sort of balance that I'd love for somebody to talk about. And also, because it does feel like there's sort of like this PR campaign that's like working against us, especially when it comes to Israel. A lot of students will say, when I was a kid, all I heard was, all these, how great Israel was, and all these celebrations in Jewish bubbles around the country. But, now on social media or wherever, people who I trust and follow and believe in with other thoughts, I'm hearing something else. It's a maybe a gaslighting of sorts, or whatever word you want to use, but it's like, then you start to think, okay, well, what do I actually stand for? So what's your message on that?
We have to change how we talk about Israel as a Jewish community, and really allow for complexity. I believe that many young Jews are being raised either with very little understanding of Israel's role in Judaism, or with a utopian mindset of Israel as a miracle, and therefore leaving no room for questioning or debating anything that Israel does or anyone within Israel does. And what happens is these students come to campus and they are confronted by those with very different perspectives, and those sometimes with misinformation, but also with some hard facts or difficult truths. And they are either turned off and they completely disassociate from Israel and sometimes from the Jewish community, or they feel deceived, and they're actually more likely to engage with those who are working counter to our community's best interests. And so what we need to do is enter complexity. We need to say that Israel is a country like every other. Israel is a democracy. The decisions are made by a government, and that government faces the voters. And we need to say, the same way as Americans, we can disagree with a policy of the American government and still, wear red, white, and blue and still be proud Americans. the same thing goes for Israel, that we can disagree or feel conflicted by a policy of the Israeli government, but still support Israel, its people, its culture. And we need to teach that complexity to the entire campus community, but we also have to teach it to ourselves. And I think the more that we add that complexity and we don't talk about standing with Israel and don't talk about, everywhere I go or, whatever I believe I'm with Israel, we need to say, I support Israel. I feel a connection to Israel. I feel I have a relationship with Israel, and use words that allow for people to have that push and pull, because that's the reality of Israel that many in our community and many outside our community have today.
Anybody else want to add anything on that, or?
Yeah, I think that actually, thank you very much, because you gave quite the answer that I wanted to give. I think that there is a thing that you cannot disconnect: Judaism with Israel, and three things are okay. You can criticize Israel if it's, we are not a perfect country. We have our issues. It's the same way in the States, in France, or in Great Britain. You can have different opinions from Israel government, or even from the way the American government is looking at Israel, but you cannot say things about Israel or detach Israel from Judaism because you heard something on your campus and you don't know the facts. This is very important to stick to the facts, to understand and to have the basic education. I don't know who mentioned education before. I think that it was you. That it's very important to stick to education and to continue the education of young Jews about Israel and about the function of Israel in Judaism and the place that it takes. Because I mentioned before the Holocaust that has happened 80 years ago, and it's not politically correct. It wasn't politically correct to talk about anti-Semitism and to be anti-Semitic in those days. But in the same manner, the same 80 years have, gave another perspective for younger Jews regarding the way they see Israel today. So I think that we have to reattach Israel to the Jews. It doesn't matter from what kind of Jews we are talking, what kind of community we are talking about. And when they are facing criticism, it's okay when it's backed by facts. And this is something we want to hear your criticism. We want to understand. Actually, we invite Jewish young people to talk about the critics that they have about Israel and what they have heard on campus, and understand how can we help in this matter. And I think that to summarize that, Judaism, Israel is the only Jewish state in the world, so it has to be connected to Judaism in a general manner.
So
there's one phrase that I use that I think touches on what both Mike and Matthew just said. Since when does rightful criticism of a government become analogous with calling for the delegitimization or the elimination of the state? And we talk about double standards, which is rife all around our world, and the double standard to which Jews are held, to which Israel is held, is something that we need to call out. I grew up hearing propaganda and lies, proudly born and raised in the Bay Area, and so much of what I saw I bought into, because it came from sources that I trusted on climate, on human rights, on equity, on race. And so I said, sure, I agree with them on all this. And if Israel is a apartheid genocide committing state, then I'm in. I'd never been. My Jewish mother had never been to Israel. I got sort of roped into a Taglit trip. I thought I was getting a free ticket to the Middle East, which I was, and I thought I'd suffer through 10 days in Israel. And landing, I'm a poster child, birthright worked magic. It was transformative for me, but landing in Israel yes, I felt a sense of homecoming and belonging and connection, absolutely. And that was visceral and undeniable. But what has lasted maybe more, what really caught me, was seeing so many of my values in action. And I realized how much had been omitted from the story, how much wasn't happening. I left Israel the first time I went with way more questions than I came in with. I've gone back, I've studied abroad, I've worked there, I go multiple times a year. I love it. I love it. I feel connected to it. And yes, we protect what we love, but we want to make it better. And part of that is criticism and fighting for it. And also recognizing that we, as American Jews, or we're not all American Jews, I'll just call I as an American Jew, do not live there, do not vote there, do not fight there. And there's also a difference, I believe, in the roles that we have to play in the diaspora as opposed to in Israel. It's messy, it's fragmented, and it's wonderful. And it's a place with a diversity of voices and perspectives. And unfortunately, only a few of them are reaching students on college campuses or progressive media or certain circles of thought in the States. And I think just got to share more stories. We can't get everybody to Israel, but the more that we can speak truth and show a myriad of entry points and how many different ways there are to be a Jew, how many different ways there are to do Judaism, to stand up for it in whatever facet, that's all welcome, that's all beautiful. And certainly we don't have to agree, but we have to agree to come together to fight the bigotry and the hatred for our survival and to thrive.
Actually, you can, just to add to what Erin just said, you can criticize Israel without being an anti-Semite when you apply the same standards for everyone. And
I do it all the time, very proudly.
Yeah, and this is exactly the same. You have to understand, if you have a standard for Israel, so you have the same standard for each country in the world, and it doesn't matter if we are talking about France or Syria. And in this context, if you have the same standards, you cannot be anti-Semitic. You can have critics. You can say whatever you think is right without being an anti-Semitic. So an anti-Semite. So this is something that has to be to be some kind of education for the younger generation, Jewish and non-Jewish.
Erin's analogy is so right, but it actually goes further in the sense of there's no other country where we have policy problems and then it becomes a talk of delegitimization of a state, but then it also goes to demonization of its people. We have problems with China and Russia, and we don't, when we see people who come from those countries, we don't attack them and hold them responsible for the policies of their government. What is happening on campuses right now is that Jewish students, American Jewish students, are being asked and held responsible for based on the perception that people have of them as Jews, that they hold certain beliefs about Israel and Israeli policy. And that's a lot of assumptions along the way, that, just because you're an American Jew, you must believe this and you must believe that and you must believe that, and that leads to the demonization of students on campus. And so everything that Erin is saying is completely right. We need to teach the differentiation between a country and its people, and how you are able to have a relationship with, love Israel, feel connection to its land, its culture, its history, its role in Jewish society and Jewish history, without necessarily being being required to be an advocate for every policy decision that a government makes.
Right, and I think a lot of that goes back to what we were saying in the beginning, and there's like this sort of fine line, right? Like we do, like Israel and the Jewish people are one, right? We want that connection to be made, but then we don't want the criticism to then fall on the Jewish people at the same time. So it really is, it's sort of deeper than some of the other things that you mentioned, right? I mean, it's a lot of times, people from other countries or other backgrounds here in America, maybe there's less of that connection in a sense as well, and it also carries over into the media, like you were saying, would you cover, are the stories being covered equally around the country? And at the end of the day, I think a lot of the a lot of it goes to trust, right? A lot of it is who can we trust when we're getting our news, when we're getting our facts, when we're getting stuff. And so that's the next question I want to pose to all of you is, who should our students be listening to if they don't have all day to dive into every single detail? Where should they be listening?
Well, I'll jump in just to say that I think anti-Semitism in many ways, as I said previously, functions similarly to many other forms of misanthropy and bigotry and oppression, right? Because when we think about certain geopolitical situations, we know that other communities have also been targeted on the basis of the relation between our country and their country of origin, or the heritage where they have heritage from, right? So you think about the way that our former president, President Trump, talked about the Wuhan flu and the Kung flu, right, and talking about all these conspiracy theories, that sort of lay the blame for the pandemic, at the feet of China, and specifically the Chinese government, which then resulted in physical attacks against the Asian American Pacific Islander community here in the United States, right? We can talk about talking about, Mexico's not sending their best, right? They're bringing guns, drugs, they're rapists, and that resulted in attacks against Mexican Americans, Latinos, immigrants of various kinds, right? In other words, various geopolitical sort of tensions and realities do shape how we relate to people that we see as somehow connected to those governments, to those conflicts, to those tensions, right? So in some ways, the Jewish community and anti-Semitism are not unique in this way. To your question about, who should students trust? I mean, I think, first of all, in general, when we're talking about anti-Semitism, you have to center Jewish voices, right? It's a general principle of anti-racism that you defer to the communities targeted by a particular form of oppression in trying to understand and combat that form of oppression. So when we talk about anti-Semitism, center Jewish voices, right? Take your cues for how you show up as an ally from the Jewish community. And I'm talking about, not some individual Jew or one group of Jews that you might find on campus, but the Jewish community as a whole, right? Because, yes, the Jewish community is a contentious lot, famously contentious, I would say, stiff-necked people. But, when it comes to things like anti-Semitism, when it comes to issues like support for the existence of the state of Israel, whatever, however we may differ in terms of what we think that state should look like, what its policy should be, most Jews actually feel that, yes, the state of Israel should exist. In other words, mostly Zionist, right? Most Jews agree where it comes to the notion that denying to Jews and Jews alone the right to statehood and self-determination through statehood is anti-Semitic. By the way, most non-Jews also agree, about 85%, according to polling, also agree that that's anti-Semitic. So there are certain things that we can agree on, and it's important not to tokenize the fringe voices within our community that that sort of align with one's own prejudices and prejudgments about any issue related to anti-Semitism or the Jewish community, but to really sort of consider what the mainstream Jewish community is saying, right? So, and there are many different organizations, Hillel is one, ADL is another, that are there to support the Jewish community, certainly the young people on campus, whether that's bringing these issues to the administration and making sure that they understand these issues well, or whether that's any number of issues off campus. Students and young people generally should understand that luckily we have a Jewish institutional structure that allows us to support and deal with these issues in a systematic way that sort of avails itself of the many, many years for which, during which we've been doing this work.
Right. I think you touched on something that's important. I want others to chime in on is this idea of this mainstream view. So much of what you hear from the fringe seems a little bit louder now, and it gives off the sort of a vibe that is now the mainstream view. I mean, you see it in certainly regular publications. Today the op-ed piece and the news article are very it's a little blurrier than it used to be back in the day, certainly. And so now, a lot of times what is, a fringe potential view is, it feels more mainstream. How do we sort of combat that? How do people understand, sort of that general view of where we stand? Even when you talk politics, when you think of the numbers of people who vote one way versus the other, there's this thought all of a sudden that has changed recently, which I'm not sure it has. So, how do we sort of, I don't know, how do we share what is mainstream and keep that the view?
We need to teach, smart news consumption. And this is not a Jewish issue, and this is not an Israel or anti-Semitism issue. This is an overarching issue. We need to teach the next generation to look at the name of the media organization, or that is being quoted, or that is being sourced, or and really question: have I heard this organization before? Do they have a track record I stand by that is, for factualness and for accuracy? We need to teach that type of media literacy. I grew up in New York, and you would, look at a newsstand in New York City, and the National Enquirer would be next to the New York Daily News, which would be next to the USA Today, next to the New York Times. And you knew which headlines were probably definitely not true and which ones were. You need that kind of media literacy, and we need to teach that more, because everything is now the same size font, everything is now getting the same attention, and things are being brought to us as opposed to us seeking them out. And we have to be a good consumer and understand what is legitimate and what is not.
In my first diplomatic mission, my ambassador told me about facts versus bias of the normal media. You have to do only one thing. You have to read the headline and look at the photo, at the picture, at the headline. It doesn't matter if it's online or if it's a newspaper. And I asked him, what do you mean by that? And he said, okay, there is a very huge difference between Israeli Air Force killed 3 Palestinian people in Gaza, and Israel response to 1,000 rockets on civil population. So from the headline and the photo that is put on the media, and it doesn't matter if it's online or offline, you can educate yourself about if this is something that is based on facts, or which is something that is completely biased because there is a bias in this kind of media. So I think this is a matter of experience, and I think this is a matter of education, and this is a thing that comes with experience. And unfortunately today we have tons of information that come to us like you just mentioned, and it makes it very, very difficult to find how do you say that, the needle in the hay, or the haystack, or I don't know. It's something.
You got it right.
I just translated it from French because I was born in France. So sorry for my English. And I just wanted to convey the message that it's very important to educate yourself about this experience, about reading headlines and pay attention to the words.
I think that's so spot on. And Matthew, you hit on it. This has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. This has to do with how we should just live, not even as, voters, just as human beings. I remember in 8th grade, so going back to basics, we had a project. We had to write an essay in support of an issue and give a public speech against it. And I so vividly remember that research process. I come from 2 parents who had vastly differing political views. And so I grew up hearing things that maybe weren't in my echo chambers, having magazines delivered at one of my parents' homes that were very different than the newspapers delivered at the other. But I'm really grateful for that, because it forced me to think critically. And people ask me all the time, what do you read? Who do you read? And I follow a lot of people with whom I do not agree. And I think that is so important, because I'm not otherizing, right? We have this us versus them, this is my side, this tribal mentality leads to polarization and divisiveness and extremism and violence, right? Like there are patterns. This is not coming out of nowhere. And so I think following different sources, reading, not being afraid to read an article in a publication where, you know, the clickbait might be things that turn you off. And also remembering to step away from the headlines and to step away from social media and the breaking news cycle that is on our televisions. That's not healthy. We have to be informed, we have to be aware, but we also have to remember that, as Vlad was saying, this is a business that they're trying to suck us into, and knowing what sells, and especially young people who are living on divisive enough college campuses, who have enough stress going on, and all of us just by the state of the world, that taking care of our mental health, choosing what to consume and how to engage matters.
All right, thank you. Well, that is actually a very perfect way to wrap this up, as we are nearing the end of our time here. I want to thank you all so much for being part of this panel. To our panelists, Matt Berger, Mike Jerquez, Vlad Chagan, and Aaron Schrody, and our co-sponsors, Halal International, the Anti-Defamation League, and the Consulate General of Israel in Miami, for this eye-opening discussion. Thank you so much. I'm putting in the chat the link where you can find all the rest of our programming happening this week. Today is just day 2 of a full week of programming. The next event of FIU's 7th Annual Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Week will be a film discussion of Bobby Yar, Context, at 4 p.m. Via Zoom. You can find a full list of events and Zoom registration links in the link I provided. Thank you all so much for joining us. And hopefully this is just the start of the conversation on campus here at FIU.
Thank you. Thanks for doing the hard work where and when it matters.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.